So here's one of the best ways to lose your faith. Sincerely believe it, but then spend zero time wondering and inquiring whether or not it's actually true. Now, we face a pretty big challenge in the church. There's well-established statistics and studies on this, and they all kind of center right around the 2/3 mark. About 2/3 of Christian kids or students are walking away from the church, usually in their college years. A significant percentage of those who drop out will never darken the door of a church again. Now, here's what I suspect happens far too often. A kid grows up in the church and gets pumped up with all kinds of confidence that Christianity is true. And they very sincerely believe. The kid may have a question or two, but these often get shut down. They may be told to just have faith, or maybe they're given some superficial answers to their questions, but the basis upon which they believe is rather thin. And then this kid finds themselves in an environment that's hostile to faith. Typically, a college campus fits the bill pretty well, right? So somebody sitting in a class very sincerely believing that Christianity is true, and all of a sudden they have this incredibly brilliant and smart professor who starts attacking the Christian faith. And often kids are just sunk because they've not been prepared to think critically about their faith. And so any challenge comes along and that house of cards sort of just falls. So I actually think we should question our faith for the sake of our faith. Right? We need to think critically about our faith. We need to get our kids, our students thinking critically about their faith. And I don't know how to do that other than ask some questions. Now, to be fair, I think we should question everything. In fact, I think the closest thing we have to a superpower is our ability to ask questions and pursue truth. It's what sets us apart in so many ways, right? We can actually reflect upon the way the world is, sort of pursue with questions the truth, and sometimes, at least from time to time, we can find the truth. In short, we can have actual knowledge of the world, and that's kind of an amazing thing if you think about it. Without inquiry, we live accidentally. We believe accidentally, right? In the sense that we might believe truly, but it's just an accident when it just happens to be true. By contrast, what I have in mind is a life of wonder and curiosity, truth-seeking, sometimes pushing back. I mean, we want to do that respectfully, of course, especially respecting our authorities or elders in our life or whatever, but pushing back nonetheless, right? I'd love to have my students push back on me in class. It just helps us dialogue and come to truth, right? Where we're asking questions and we're just living rationally with respect to our lives. Now, this is not just something to do to get ahead in life. I actually think it's part of what it is to be human. Aristotle began his metaphysics this way, to say that all men by nature desire to know. And I think Genesis gives us a really good reason to think of humans in the same sort of way. Even all the way back into Genesis 1, as God is laying out what people are supposed to do, this idea comes up that they are to subdue the earth. Right, but he doesn't provide a kind of instruction manual of how to subdue and sort of cultivate things in reality. We have to use our critical thinking. We have to be curious about the world. So I want to suggest that being a truth seeker is really how we've been created. It's part of our design. It is part of our nature. Now, the most famous dictum on this in philosophy, at least, comes from the 5th century Greek philosopher Socrates.
Socrates? Hey, we know that name.
Yeah! Hey, look him up. Oh, it's under Socrates.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody knows Socrates and loves Socrates. Socrates famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Now, this is a very often quoted line, right? But oftentimes it's quoted completely out of context. So this line comes in Plato's Apology, where Plato gives the description of Socrates' trial, where he's on trial for his life. Now, why does Socrates find himself on a trial for his life? Because he's been questioning the authorities and the kind of power structures of his day. At one point in the trial, a lesser sentence is considered. And what's considered is exile, but it's quickly rejected. And it's rejected by Socrates, by the way, right? Because that would be a life in which he can't engage in dialogue and discussion, and in this sense, examination. So Socrates says, the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining, notice, myself and others. The summum bonum for Socrates, right? The greatest good is to engage in dialogue and examine himself and examine others. Take this away, and this is not a life even worth living. And indeed, Socrates gives his life for this. So in many ways, Socrates is the epitome of rejecting a life of compromise, right? He refuses to simply take someone's word for it without any reflection or critical thought. And he's famous for asking questions. Now, is Socrates annoying at times? Yeah, he describes himself as a kind of gadfly. Does it cost him his life? Also, yes. But for him, he gives his life in the pursuit of truth. Now, good news, most of us won't have to face a capital trial for this kind of thing. Now, I'm not sure how that all sounds to you, but here comes perhaps the controversial bit. We should question everything, but we should also in that question our faith, or if you prefer, we should question our worldview. I think this is for any person of faith or religious commitment or no religious commitment, right? Whatever our worldview is, we should be asking the deep and difficult questions about that worldview. One reason why this may sound controversial is because people, I mean, many non-Christians for sure, but also many Christians think that faith by its very nature is the sort of thing you can't question, almost by definition. Now, I disagree. I mean, I really disagree with that. In fact, I think that's a dangerous misunderstanding of faith. Rather than thinking of faith as unquestioned belief, I don't think we even get faith in the right category there. Faith is not a kind of belief. Faith is a kind of trust. It's a way to trust. And on my view, it's a way of trusting where we venture our lives on someone or something. I think it's entirely impossible to get along in life without faith. We have to place faith in our chairs. We have to place faith in cars. We have to place faith in people around us. As kids, we place faith in our parents. When we get married, we place faith in our spouses, and so on and so forth. I think we have to place faith in people and things for our very survival, but certainly we won't flourish as human beings if we're not placing faith in the right places. And that's kind of the point, is that you can trust something blindly. You can get on an airplane knowing nothing about it, or trust somebody who's maybe let you down many times in the past. It's just not a good idea. We should place faith in those things for which we have good reasons to think that those things are trustworthy, or you might call it faith-worthy. So the point is that we need good reasons. How are we going to come across good reasons? Well, I think a big part of that pursuit is to ask good questions. I mean, when is it ever a good thing to just blindly trust someone or something? When someone's wanting us to just, don't worry, trust me, typically they're up to no good. So even assuming Christianity is true, wouldn't it be better if we had knowledge that it's true? Wouldn't it be better that we've pursued its truth and we've found it to be true? And I really think that if Christianity is true, then it will supply the answers that we are seeking. But we have to learn to do this well. So I'm going to give you 5 tips for questioning your faith and everything else. Tip number 1 is to ask questions as a truth seeker. What we want to avoid are 2 ditches. We want to avoid the ditch of skepticism and avoid the ditch of what I'm going to call fundamentalism. What the skeptic does is just simply tries to disprove a view because they assume that the view is false. Whereas what the fundamentalist does ignores evidence for what they assume is true. But you see the kind of common element there is that both of them are just making assumptions. They're not asking questions to really try to find the truth. They've already got their minds made up about what is true. So the way I like to say it is that your posture here matters, and you should have the posture of a truth seeker rather than a posture of being a skeptic or the posture of a fundamentalist. So if you're still not sure that we should be, sort of questioning our faith, it might be because you're imagining the posture of a skeptic. Right? And it could be a very hostile skeptic, a kind of angry skeptic, the one who's sort of shaking his or her fist at God and questioning in this sort of hostile way. But that's, of course, not the posture being recommended here. It's not the posture of a truth seeker. In fact, when we're hostile towards some claim, it's very often the case that we won't find the truth. We're just going to be too emotional, or we're too sort of personally invested in that truth or that claim, either being true or false, to really navigate our way to the most rational position. I think actually the best passage that sort of clarifies what sort of posture we should have as we approach God comes in Matthew 22, where Jesus is being challenged by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so on. And then the challenge that is given is, what is the greatest commandment? What is the greatest command? Jesus, seemingly without hesitation, says, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. So think about this. What Jesus is giving us is a kind of posture for pursuing God. And it's a posture of love. It's a posture of being a lover. We're seeking God in order to know him, and we seek him and love him with our heart, soul, and mind. So I'm not sure what it is to love God with our mind other than to ask questions in the pursuit of God. All right, tip number 2 is to cultivate curiosities. Now, I'm convinced that all of us have curiosities. Kids are great with this. They just ask these really great questions and kind of blow our minds sometimes with the richness of the question that they might not even realize the depth of it, that kind of a thing. But as we get older, we tend to stuff down those curiosities. And what I'm suggesting here is that now we need to get back in the practice of cultivating those things, those sort of that place of wonder, that place of curiosity. I think we have to attend to those things that we find interesting. What catches our mind's eye, where we say these things like, I've always wondered about that, or this is maybe, sometimes it's what's bothered us, right? This has always kind of bothered me, or I've always wondered about this. Well, don't ignore those things, right? We lean in and we cultivate the curiosity and the wonder, again, not as a hostile skeptic, but as a seeker in order to know. I think it's best to start with what you find interesting, what you're curious about, because what you're curious about is likely very different from what I'm curious about. And that's fine. We kind of all come at this from different approaches, but the important thing is just to be on the journey. I always find it striking that in Luke chapter 2, where Jesus is a 12-year-old, right? He's a 12-year-old, and they visit Jerusalem, and then on their way back, they realize that Jesus isn't with them. And so they're, upset, they're worried, they come back, they find Jesus sitting in the temple. I'm not sure that's what most 12-year-olds would be doing, but they find Jesus sitting among the temple teachers, and it says that he's listening and asking questions. I think what we find is 12-year-old Jesus just being curious. He's got questions. He's in the posture of a seeker here. All right, and tip number 3 is to take your time. Take lots of deep breaths here. Take lots of moments, because sometimes this can be a struggle, and there's just times to put it aside and not be too worried about it. Don't leave it there, right? Come back to it again and again and again. But do take your time. This is sometimes called the intellectual virtue of steadfastness, where we don't change our beliefs too quickly. We sort of remain steadfast in what we've come to see as true, even in the face of challenge, right? This is a virtue because we don't want to be willy-nilly. We don't want to just give up our beliefs the second we have some questions. Now, it might feel like the whole world hangs in the balance while you try to answer this question. But if it feels like that, then almost certainly it's too emotionally charged, and you probably do need to take a breath, take a break, because most questions in just the normal course of working out theology or philosophy or whatever the case may be, right? It's the whole thing doesn't just turn on what you say about that particular question. I think what you need to do is weigh out your reasons for and against. What you have to work out is, what do you right now, sitting here right now, what do you know? And then you balance that against the objection or the question that's being raised. And you work out a consistent view as you go. But notice, this just takes time. It takes time to kind of do the both sides thing, to understand reasons for and against. So take your time. That's going to be totally fine. My fourth tip is to do this in community. There's very often we can kind of just get in our own heads where something doesn't make sense or something seems like a really scary, really bad problem. And sometimes it's just the articulating it to others, and you can kind of see your way through it. Ideally, you would find someone who's a little further down the path than you are that can help you walk through those things. You need mentors. I think it's great when you can have friends that are just around you, and maybe they're also asking the same sorts of questions, and you can bounce ideas off of each other and that sort of a thing. But I also think it's really helpful to have what I might call interlocutors. And these would be people who have a different view than you. They need to be friendly in the sense that they're not hostile, but it is such a gift to have somebody who thinks really different than you, and you can have these very civil, heartfelt conversations and kind of, again, bounce ideas off each other and help test the reasonability of our arguments and things like that. Now, I think the face-to-face community is just essential. But I think one thing that we don't want to leave out here is that you've got a lifetime supply, and many lifetime supply probably, of community to be had, and that is the community had with reading good books. So there are more books than you could possibly read, and there's going to be books that cover or are related to whatever questions you're asking, and you need to avail yourself of those good books. With that, I would consider reading some old books. When a book has stood the test of time, usually there's a reason for that. And so think about reading some old books. C.S. Lewis has a great little entry on this about the value of reading old books. And I love this quote. He says, "We need to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books." Okay, tip number 5 is to just be honest. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with where you're at. And do, in fact, take a hard look. We're looking for the truth, but being honest in that means that there's going to be times in which we're going to say, I don't know. We just haven't, we're just in process. We're still figuring it out. It just means we haven't hit the destination yet. We're still on the journey. We're still working towards finding truth and gaining reasons as we go. And that's absolutely the case for me as I sit here right now. I've got questions, and I don't necessarily have great answers for all of them. I'm still in process. I think that something like the problem of evil is a pretty difficult problem. And I'm still somewhat in process. Now, I've got a lot of good answers for it, but I don't think I've solved the issue by any stretch. Now, remember, I do this for a living. I get paid to sort of lean into these questions and work on them and write about them and talk to students about them. And that's not going to be everybody's situation, of course. And so it's very okay for you to have a few questions that you do not yet know the answer for. I think that's us pursuing God with our mind, or loving God with our mind. So this lands us in a place of what we would call intellectual humility, another intellectual virtue, where we just understand that we're not going to have it all figured out, and that's okay. I think this just points us to where Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 says that we see through a glass dimly. I mean, that's just really our perspective for a time, is that we will not get it all figured out. And I think the Bible is actually really clear on this, that our posture is to be one of seeking. There's this invitation over and over and over again, actually, all throughout the Bible, to seek God, and oftentimes there's a promise that God will be found. Deuteronomy 4:29 says, "But if from there you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul." Jeremiah 29:13 says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Now, these passages have to, of course, be put into context, but you just see this theme running throughout, and it's in the New Testament as well. Jesus is a big proponent of this, that we are to seek God and we will find. He says in Matthew 7:7-8, says, "Ask and it will be given to you." He's inviting us to ask the question. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Paul in Acts 17, I love this passage too, his Mars Hill address. Paul says, "God created so that the inhabitants of the earth would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." In a previous video, I give my story about going through a season of doubt. And what it was is that I realized that I had never genuinely and actually questioned my faith. I just sort of always assumed it was true, and then asking the questions really threw me into this time of doubt. Now, a lot of people walk away precisely here, as we said, sitting in that college classroom or some sort of hostile work environment, and they've never questioned their faith, and somebody presses them on that, and they just walk away. People are hurt. Sometimes they're embarrassed by their the credulity that they've had, right? But for me, I didn't walk away because I didn't know that it was true, but I also didn't know that it was false either. I had to figure it out. I couldn't just let it be. And so what did I do? I began asking questions, right? And I've never stopped. I've never stopped this journey of questioning my faith. And again, as I say in that video, I found a lot of answers to those questions. For me, Christianity has borne the weight of my questions.